Welcome to Unit 2. In this unit, I'll be explaining the concept of customer sovereignty and how it underpins a sort of traditional neoclassical theory of consumer behavior. Number 2, I'll be discussing some of the assumptions and outcomes that can be derived from the traditional neoclassical approach to consumer behavior. I'll also be discussing the limitations of neoclassical consumer theory. I'll be briefly touching on the main tenets of behavioral theory, such as framing effects, prediction, availability, and adaptation, and their implications for consumer choice. I'll also be outlining and assessing the different views on libertarian paternalism. And then I'll explain the neoclassical and behavioral approaches for designing policies and relating it to policy design in Nigeria. So let's get started. There are three main traditional approaches to consumer behavior: the preclassical, the neoclassical, and the classical. But while I'll be briefly talking about the preclassical and the classical, we'll be focusing on the neoclassical. So the origins of the preclassical traditional view can be found in the work of philosophers like Aristotle. Aristotle said that Aristotle based economics on needs and analyzed their nature and proceeded to isolate economic goods by which economic needs they satisfied. So quite a rational approach. The classical theory was popularized by probably the world's most famous economist, Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, when he was talking about consumer behavior, he referred to the invisible hand of the market, explaining that humans act rationally. So there's no need for any central price planning mechanism. Classical theories of consumer behavior are also quite rational. They say that the market moves automatically to produce more of what people want. Adam Smith really advocated for a laissez-faire or hands-free, laid-back style of governance, where demand and supply would be the primary factors that influence consumption. Classical economists also argued that the free market was the only way that society could be brought into natural harmony. And to many classical economists, government planning or government interference in the market was unnatural and unnecessary. Neoclassical theories of consumer behavior are quite similar in that they're built around rational choice theory. And this is the idea that human beings act rationally to maximize their level of utility or enjoyment. However, compared to classical theory, neoclassical theory highlights the roles of marginalism and perception. Marginalism highlights the pleasure and utility experienced from the consumption of one extra unit of a particular good. So the marginal or the additional consumption of that one extra piece. Classical theory also focuses on the idea that price is determined by costs required to produce a particular good or service. However, neoclassical theory recognizes the role of consumer perception in determining the price or demand for goods or services. Neoclassical theory would also assume that saving and borrowing decisions are largely rational. And there's quite a common phrase used to describe the human being and the way that we make decisions and the way that we consume in neoclassical theory, and it's called homo economicus, homo economicus. And this is, the rational man, the man that assesses, uses evidence to decide exactly what he wants, and is not influenced by very much except rational thought. However, subsequently, the behavioral view has been proposed, and that's very different from the traditional preclassical, classical, and neoclassical views, and the view of the human being as completely rational in their decision making. So the behavioral view challenges the notion of the completely rational homo economicus, which was previously the dominant perspective on human behavior in economics. Justin Fox wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review called Irrationality's Revenge. And it was all about the fact that actually we're a lot less rational than we think. So after a century of believing that human beings are primarily rational, many economists kind of began to find out that that wasn't the case. There are lots of psychological phenomena, such as bias, context, framing, and heuristics that affect our decision making. And when these insights from psychology were taken into consideration, it produced a more realistic picture of what people in the real world actually do, as opposed to what we would like them to do. So I think we all like the idea that human beings are completely rational and make their decisions based only on the evidence. But we know that things like framing, for instance, in this picture, frozen yogurt contains 10% fat, or frozen yogurt is 80% fat free. Frozen yogurt contains 10% fat, frozen yogurt is 90% fat free. Even though those two labels are saying exactly the same thing, people react differently to them, and that's an example of how the message was framed. And in the next few slides, I'll be talking a bit more about the behavioral view and how that affects policy. So just some concepts in behavioral theory to be familiar with. First of all, the concept of framing, which I briefly touched on. So a frame is the way that choices are described and presented, and small details matter. Framing a question or an offering in a different way often generates a new response. When you change a comparison set it's viewed in. So I gave the example of the yogurt, which could either be labeled as 10% fat or 90% fat-free, and the difference that would make in the minds of the consumer. But there's also been a lot of studies in the wording of Brexit, for instance, what people had to vote for during Brexit, either leave or remain. And people say that if the frames were different and maybe some of the wordings were switched, then perhaps it would have had a different outcome. I don't know about that, but or how far that's true, and I'm sure that there's a lot of research that you can do independently to find out from psychologists how much that affected the outcome of this referendum. But framing is a very well studied psychological concept, and it proves that perhaps we're not as rational as we think we are. There's also the concept that I'd like to introduce you to of libertarian paternalism. And libertarian paternalism is the idea that it's both possible and legitimate for private and public institutions to affect behavior while respecting freedom of choice. And this is quite a powerful concept that was highlighted in quite a famous book called Nudge, where you don't force people to do a particular thing, but you can nudge them in the direction that you want them to go to. And a lot of people argue that this is okay. It's okay for governments to do this, and there are various ways that I'll be discussing on the next slide that policymakers can do this. But some people argue against it. So, as we said before, Adam Smith argues that the invisible hand of the market allocates resources in the most effective manner, and this negates the need for government intervention. But Mankiw argues that the market is indeed powerful, and the hand of the market has a lot of power, but it's by no means all-knowing, and there are limitations to the hand of the market that come in form of externalities, and externalities can be positive or negative consequences of economic output that affect the bystander. An example that I gave earlier of a negative externality is pollution from a factory, and some industries produce a lot of pollution that affects people. And some governments use policy to try and reduce pollution levels and protect citizens from its harmful effects. Economists have argued that perhaps, there's a way that private sector can do this on their own, regulate negative externalities on their own. And this is called the Coase theorem, after the economist that put the idea forward. Although it sounds logical, it often fails in practice, making a case for some form of government intervention into the market. So I just want to summarize what I've said so far before we go on to the last slide, which is also on policy. This whole unit has been around looking at the reasons why people consume. And we started off by saying, it's logical, it's rational. People see products and they want them because that's what they need. And I think that conversation has evolved slightly to look at different reasons why people can be persuaded and nudged to do things that they normally wouldn't do, and how we're all not as rational as we think we are. And because we're not as rational as we think we are, and because we can be nudged in certain directions and persuaded to do things that aren't particularly in our best interest, then sometimes the government does need to intervene in the market, and they can do that in several ways. One way is regulation of the individual. So they can restrict our choices or eliminate choices altogether, and that's been done in practice before, where our choices are restricted. So governments, doctors may be perfectly willing to offer abortion services, but many governments make it illegal for people to purchase abortion services, and it also makes it illegal for doctors to provide those services. So they can restrict choices or eliminate those choices. Number two, they can use fiscal measures, so fiscal incentives and fiscal disincentives, and we see that done as well, where a fiscal incentive would be our school feeding program in Nigeria. So if you send your children to school in Nigeria, there's a chance that they will get a free school meal, which saves poorer families money. And fiscal disincentives in Nigeria would be the taxes, so the luxury taxes, for instance, put on imported alcohol, even imported rice. So those are things that the government can do to intervene in markets and incentivize certain behavior and disincentivize certain behavior for the greater good. The third way that governments can intervene is to guide and sort of enable our choices. So they can use persuasion. They can provide information, and I think doctors provide information about why people should stop smoking, for instance. We can use societal norms, changes in the physical environment. So things like taking lifts out of a building, for instance, would encourage people to walk more, or taking soft drink vending machines out of the office, for instance, would hopefully stop people buying as many soft drinks in the office. And then there's also changes in the default policy, like some countries have an opt-out policy for organ transplants. So instead of asking people to opt in, everybody already is on the donor list. And if you don't want to be on the donor list, then you have to physically opt out. And that makes it a bit more difficult, or it adds an extra step in terms of people having to physically opt out, go on a website, type in their details, wait for a letter, etc. So it makes more people on the donor register, makes the availability of donor organs higher. So those are the kind of policy interventions that governments can choose to make that affect our behavior.